We received confirmation that the latest reciprocal tariffs will not be imposed on Canada.
There are ongoing discussions, but there's no ongoing negotiation.
Vehicles are Canada's second largest export by value at $51 billion. The vast majority of those, 93%, go to the U.S.
The escalation of trade wars and tariffs over the past few years marks a fundamental shift in Canada's energy and trade policies towards the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump's trade protectionism, sweeping tariff hikes, and frequent additional sanctions against trading partners have pushed Canada not only to retaliate but also to seek multilateral trade in the medium and long term. Of course, the energy dependence between Canada and the US has historical and geographical roots. But today, we see that Canada's idea of finding different markets and partners instead of the US has moved from a theoretical agenda to concrete projects. This is not only in oil and gas, but in many other sectors, from mining to automobiles. In the recent elections in Canada, the public's reaction to Donald Trump's trade and tariff policies led them to support leaders with the idea of reducing dependence on the US. In the case of Mark Carney, promises to put us in the best position to negotiate with the US to build new trade partnerships worked. In his campaign, Carney announced goals such as protecting the automotive and critical mineral supply chain, speeding up the approval of energy projects, and tapping alternative markets outside the US. In energy, there is talk of new deals with giant markets such as the EU, China, and even Japan. In essence, this is the political expression of Canada's strategy of distributing exports rather than selling to the US as the sole buyer. The diversity of its energy resources, oil sands, LNG, hydroelectricity, minerals such as nickel, cobalt, lithium, makes Canada valuable in both conventional energy and green transformation. If the trade war with the US and tariffs continue to escalate, Canada can strengthen its commercial independence by channeling these natural resources to Europe, Asia, and other markets. Moreover, while the EU is looking for more options for gas and oil supplies in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, it sees Canadian resources as safe and environmentally friendly. This is an unpleasant scenario for the US. When Trump took office under the slogan of America First, he imposed high tariffs on sectors he considered strategic, such as iron and steel, aluminum, and automobiles. Global players such as China and the European Union have been among the hardest hit. But Canada has also been hit hard. When the Trump administration imposed tariffs of 25% on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, 25% on automobiles, and 25% on all products, the government in Ottawa retaliated with tariffs on $60 billion worth of US goods. This essentially marked the point at which free trade between the two neighbors was shaken. While oil and gas were not directly targeted, the overall trade climate declined. Canadian politicians debated whether to retaliate in a similar way in the energy sector. All options are on the table, Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson said, for the first time legitimizing the idea that we could turn off the oil valves to the US. Although provinces like Alberta opposed it, even this was indicative of a growing backlash in Canada. Of course, a restriction or an additional tax could also hurt the Canadian economy. But even this harsh rhetoric was important in signaling that Canada is now reconsidering its dependence on the US. This is because there is a huge volume of daily energy flows between the US and Canada. Therefore, retaliation was put on the table as a potential Plan B. A closer look at the economic integration in North America since the 2010s shows that Canada and the US are natural partners. Especially in the energy sector, the level of interdependence between these two neighbors is quite high. For years, Canada was the largest supplier of oil and natural gas to the US, while the US was Canada's largest buyer. Pipelines, NAFTA, and geographical proximity form the solid backbone of this relationship. However, former US President Donald Trump's America First policies, aggressive tariffs, and protectionist practices that deepened the trade war were enough to shake the entire balance in North America. As soon as he took office, Trump announced additional tariffs on almost the entire range of products, including steel and aluminum. The countries hit hardest by this policy were China, the European Union, and of course Canada. In retaliation, Canada imposed tariffs on imports from the US. In particular, the automobile and energy sectors have become the most strategic topics in this customs duel. The long-standing trust and traditional belief in automatic cooperation between the two countries began to give way to an environment of great competition and mistrust. In the Canadian elections held around April 2025, Mark Carney's election to the Canadian presidency further accelerated this search for different markets instead of the US. During his campaign, Carney openly stated that "I will put Canada in the most advantageous position in negotiations with the United States," while at the same time gaining public support with promises of broader trade partnerships, independence in energy projects. This was because Canadian voters, shaken by Trump's 25% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, had become more vocal in their desire to be free from dependence on exports to the US. Now these promises are translating into Canada's brand new energy and trade strategy. Canada's energy exports to the United States accelerated in the 1950s. Growing US industry and military spending required more and more crude oil. While importing oil from continental Europe or the Middle East was considered difficult, expensive, or risky, Canada became the closest safe supply as a northern neighbor. During the oil crises of the 1970s, Canada played the role of the most reliable ally in easing US dependence on foreign supplies. Free trade agreements, especially NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in 1994, cemented this energy dependence on a legal basis. Pipeline projects were rapidly built. Millions of barrels of Canadian oil began flowing into US refineries every day, mainly through the Keystone and Enbridge main pipelines. A similar mechanism occurred with natural gas. Canada sold its rich gas reserves to the US cheaply and stably, and the US benefited from this resource for both industrial consumption and home heating. By the 2010s, economic models showed that 95% of Canada's crude oil and natural gas exports went to the US. Of course, in the process, production efforts in Canada's oil sands have sparked environmental controversy. In addition, pipeline routes crossed lands inhabited by Indigenous peoples. There were protests and judicial processes, but in general, the idea of selling energy to the US market was a strategy supported by all Canadian governments, until the advantages of the US as a trading partner were questioned. When Donald Trump took office in early 2017, he was highly critical of global trade agreements. Canada initially expected no major confrontation, as it was the US's closest ally and NAFTA partner. However, Trump emphasized that he could impose tariffs on anyone, and that the US was complaining about its trade deficit. Thus, tariffs of 25% or higher were imposed on a variety of products, including steel and aluminum. These measures also hit traditional allies: Canada, the EU, Japan, etc. In retaliation to the tariffs, the Canadian government imposed its own tariffs on $60 billion worth of US goods, especially automobiles and agricultural products. At this point, the debate turned to will it be extended to energy. Tensions escalated further when Canadian Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson said, "If necessary, we can cut the oil and gas we send to the US." Of course, a restriction or additional tax could also harm the Canadian economy. But even this harsh rhetoric was important in signaling that Canada is now reconsidering its dependence on the US. This is because there is a huge volume of daily energy flows between the US and Canada. Therefore, retaliation was put on the table as a potential Plan B. Public opinion polls conducted during this period showed that Canadian voters have become more critical of the US in response to Trump's tariffs on Canada. This led to the popularization of less dependence on the US promises by leaders such as Mark Carney in the 2025 Canadian elections. Voters perceived that the single market, the US, is risky. It is cornering us with protectionism. In the end, Carney's electoral victory was realized with the rhetoric of a Canada that stands on its own 2 feet and builds alternative trade and energy partnerships. Carney and his team are now drawing a new roadmap under the following headings. 1. Accelerate energy projects. Quickly approve new pipelines and LNG terminals for both domestic, West-East corridor, and exports, and manage environmental impact assessments as rationally as possible, thus providing direct access to European and Asian markets. 2. Alternative trade partnerships to the US. Offer new long-term contracts to major consumer markets such as the European Union, China, and Japan. The goal is to increase non-US exports to 60% in the next 10 years. 3. Financial aid from tariff revenues. If tariffs with the US continue, Canada will channel the revenue from these taxes to the affected sectors. 4. Automotive and critical minerals. To encourage partnerships with the EU or Asia, shifting Canada's automotive supply chain away from dependence on the US. Electric vehicle, EV battery production, and rare earth element mining are among the most important. Energy plays a key role in this multilateral trade strategy. Canada is not completely giving up selling oil and gas to the US, of course, but it does not want to put all its eggs in the same basket. The European market, shaken by the Russia-Ukraine war, presents a great opportunity for Canada. Let's buy gas from Canada instead of Russia. We can buy gas from the US, but there is political risk there. China, on the other hand, is an energy-hungry giant, and its bad relationship with the US makes Canada a more attractive supplier. Thus, Beijing may be of the mindset that, by establishing better relations with Canada, we can distance ourselves from the US. Europe, seeking to reduce its dependence on Russia, had started buying LNG from the US. But Europeans, dissatisfied with prices and political conditions, point to Canada as a green and stable supplier. On the one hand, with LNG terminals and pipeline projects, Canada is preparing to send crude oil and natural gas from its east coast to the European market. On the other hand, LNG shipments to Asia from the west coast are on the agenda. Once these projects are completed, Canada can achieve a more balanced distribution of its energy exports instead of relying on the US for 95% of its energy exports. Similarly, in the automotive sector, the EU is seeking cooperation with Canada for electric vehicles and critical minerals. This can be read in the context of discomfort with protectionism and tariffs on American companies in automobile electrification. In contradiction with the US, the EU finds Canada more attractive. In the process of moving away from the US, Canada needs to expand its transatlantic shipping infrastructure. Currently, ports on Canada's west coast are largely designed to handle cargo to Asia. LNG terminals are underdeveloped. On the east coast, there are potential ports across the Atlantic to Europe. Building new pipelines, refineries, and shipping terminals will require 5 to 10 years of investment. It is therefore practically impossible to, tomorrow, abandon the US market and turn entirely to Europe and China. Nevertheless, government initiatives such as the Trade Diversification Corridor Fund are encouraging this infrastructure breakthrough. There is talk of a multi-billion-dollar project portfolio. Diversifying shipping lanes could also give Canada pricing power. Canadian companies, which until now have said, "We sell to the US to keep energy prices low," could earn higher margins on Asian and European demand. For US refiners, this is an unpleasant scenario. If Canadian oil and gas goes to Asia at higher prices, US refiners may no longer have access to as cheap crude as before. This could be passed on to the US consumer. Likewise, it may become increasingly difficult for the US to capitalize on its position as the logistically closest buyer. Another front of the war has opened in the automotive and transportation sector. Trump imposed 25% tariffs to protect US automobile production. In retaliation, Canada imposed high tariffs on cars and some spare parts from the US. This vicious circle undermines the integrated automotive supply chain between the two countries. Thanks to NAFTA, parts and semi-finished products cross the border several times to produce cars. The increased tariffs have forced automakers into strategies such as producing in Canada and selling to the US, or vice versa. Some companies are considering shifting production to Mexico or Asia, saying, "Why should we stay in such an uncertain political environment?" The electric vehicle, EV, transition further complicates this picture. Canada has critical minerals in batteries such as lithium, nickel, and cobalt. The EU has tightened its policies to ban internal combustion engines from 2035. This means more demand for minerals for electric vehicles. The US is undergoing a similar transformation, but laws, incentives, and high tariffs are challenging EU and Asian producers. Canada, on the other hand, is using its green image to offer less bureaucracy and a more collaborative approach to mining projects. Countries such as Germany and France tend to prefer Canada, feeling fed up with tariff tensions with the US. Canada can therefore strengthen its automotive and technology ties with the EU by selling critical minerals. For the US, this is a risk. With a trade war already underway, Canada saying, "We are giving our minerals to the EU," could increase the procurement costs of US companies. Canada's relations with China have also been strained at a time of heightened tensions with the US. Issues such as Huawei and 5G created a crisis between Canada and China. Nevertheless, since China is a huge market in energy and mining, Canada did not close the door completely. If Trump's tariffs continue, Canadian companies may expand their cooperation with Beijing, sending a message to the US that we have an alternative. For China, Canada is a Western but not aggressive like the US actor with rich hydrocarbons, minerals, and clean energy potential. However, such a rapprochement would also make it difficult for Canada to strike a diplomatic balance in terms of its NATO membership and military ties with the US. Still, pragmatic interests may prevail. The trade war is leading each country to pursue a no-win, no-lose strategy. In the US, those who have been hurt by the trade war have criticized the Trump administration. Tariffs have raised production costs and driven a wedge between us and our allies. Canada's decision to look to other markets instead of the US is a case in point. In the US, refiners, automotive giants, farmers, etc. have complained about this policy. However, Trump and others of his ilk insist that dependence on Canada is also dangerous. Protectionism protects our country. In the short term, the US may be able to raise tariffs on Canadian imports, perhaps generating customs revenue or protecting its own producers. But in the medium term, the US faces a situation like Canada is slipping out of our hands as its non-US relations strengthen. For a long time, there was a concept of North American energy security. Now it's crumbling, energy experts say. If Canada completes the infrastructure to open up to European and Asian markets and reduces its dependence on the US from 95% to 60%, the US may not be able to get Canadian oil as easily as it used to if it needs it in a future crisis. This could create a strategic vulnerability for the US. In short, it could be one of the counterproductive consequences of the trade war for the US. Such a process poses various risks for the US economy. 1. Shrinking energy market. Canada's declining dependence on the US for energy exports puts US access to affordable Canadian supplies at risk. If demand falls or Canada turns down the valve, US refineries could struggle. 2. Price and competitive disadvantage. If Europe buys LNG and oil from Canada instead of the US energy giants could lose revenue. During the Trump era, the European market was seen as a great potential. If Canada's share increases, American companies may be forced to cut prices or turn to other markets. 3. Innovation and supply chain issues. EU-Canada agreements on automobiles and mining could disrupt US plans to supply electric vehicles and minerals. For example, American companies depend on Canadian sources for lithium or nickel. But now that partnerships with the EU have developed, the US market could take a back seat. 4. Loss of geopolitical power. Energy shipments have long been a tool of US influence over its allies. If Europe and others develop more intensive cooperation with Canada, the US's power to exert pressure through energy could diminish. This could weaken Washington's diplomatic initiatives on a global scale. In short, while Trump wants to protect the US economy with his protectionist moves, he has accelerated Canada's and Europe's search for alternatives. Canada is turning to new trading partners with the message that we will not be cowed by unfair tariffs, jeopardizing what the US sees as its natural market. Of course, not everyone in Canada supports this transformation. The province of Alberta, as the region that sells the most oil to the US market, criticizes the retaliation against the US decisions, since the majority of pipelines flow to the US. In short, within Canada too, there are many who say that redirecting exports will not happen immediately. Access to new markets requires huge infrastructure projects, LNG terminals, new pipelines, port expansions. These projects may also face environmental and indigenous resistance. Nevertheless, the tariffs imposed by the US are forcing us to think about these things. While Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team are strong advocates of trade diversification and energy independence, the province of Alberta believes that we've been moving all our exports to the US market, and a sudden change of direction would make it more difficult. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says, "Threatening to turn down the oil valve against the US is unrealistic. It would hurt our economy and American refiners."
Have one of the largest deposits of oil and natural gas on the planet. It is significantly larger and far more accessible than the quickly declining oil and gas reserves located in the United States.
So, the federal government and Alberta's objectives are not exactly aligned. Alberta advocates a long-term transition. The Carney government is of the opinion that leaders like Trump could come again, and we need to be prepared. There are also environmental and indigenous issues. A government that wants to quickly approve new pipelines or LNG terminals could face backlash from environmentalists and indigenous communities. But even these communities may be partially persuaded by the "we should not trust the US" sentiment created by Trump's tariffs. "Let's determine our own destiny" could create a sense of unity. Still, indigenous communities want to be included in projects and have their rights protected. So, the practical implementation will be challenging. After years of trade wars and tariffs, the relationship between Canada and the United States is unlikely to be completely severed. The two countries are still geopolitically and geographically very close and share a huge trade volume. However, instead of a one-way high-dependency system, a multilateral alternative era can be entered. While Canada retains a significant portion of the oil and gas it sells to the US, it could diversify its revenues by expanding into the EU and Asian markets. This would reduce its economic dependence on the US and strengthen Canadian leaders' hand at the diplomatic table. The US, on the other hand, could try to make up for the lost share from its own domestic production or other sources, but it may not succeed completely. Europe has good reasons to look to Canada for a secure energy source in the aftermath of the Russian crisis. The country is geopolitically stable, its environmental standards are perhaps more predictable than those of the US, and its protectionist tussles with the US administration have brought Europeans closer to Canada. This is an outcome that could undermine US global energy influence. Of course, Canada also needs to make huge investments, an endeavor that will pay off in 5 to 10 years. On the Chinese side, if relations with Canada improve, there could be projects that bypass the US. This is a blow to Washington's Asia-Pacific strategy. Therefore, the US may want to restrain Canada by saying, "Don't go too far." But the Canadian public may be fed up with Trump's tough stance and may say, "This time we will look after our interests too." From the perspective of other regions, such as Turkey, these developments signal a major transformation in the world energy and trade map. America's claim to be the energy superpower is being challenged by Canada's pluralistic option approach. Every move triggered by the trade war changes the direction of logistics lines and global shipments. A more distant, more negotiation-oriented period, which we can perhaps call the new normal in US-Canada relations, has begun. The decades-long reliable energy supplier model between Canada and the US is losing steam due to Trump's trade war policies and high tariffs. Canada is turning to new partnerships, both due to changing domestic political dynamics, such as Carney's victory, and signals from the global market. While Europe is giving importance to Canada after the Russian crisis, China could use Canada's geopolitical position in its tensions with the US. Thus, Canadian energy, which is almost 100% dependent on the US market, is developing a multifaceted export strategy. For the US, these developments mean economic risk and loss of diplomatic power. Canada, on the other hand, is in need of major investments. There are interprovincial disputes and obstacles such as environmental and indigenous resistance. In the long run, however, it wants to continue its policy of risk reduction by dividing its eggs in one basket. What does this mean for the rest of the world? New competition in energy prices and logistics, Europe's efforts to break its dependence on US gas, Asia's increasing share of Canada in LNG demand. All this is leading to a redrawing of global shipping lanes. The term trade war refers to a comprehensive struggle that is not limited to tariffs but extends to the energy and mining sectors. Canada's opening up to other markets instead of the United States calls into question the future of the North American common market and raises concerns among US companies and lobbies. In a new multipolar and complex world, the diversification strategy of countries is becoming more prominent. While Canada will never completely abandon trade integration with the US, it is more open than ever to the idea of working with more EU, Asian, and alternative partners. This move may go down in history as one of the most unexpected outcomes of Trump's tariffs and trade war. Canada, for years the US's most loyal energy supplier, is now looking for other avenues, thus weakening the US's energy clout. This story is yet another example of how protectionist policies in international relations often backfire. In the coming period, Canada's LNG terminals, energy agreements with the EU and Asia, and critical mineral cooperation in the automotive sector should be closely monitored. These moves will shape not only Canada-US relations, but also the geo-economic balance of power around the world. Energy trade and diplomacy are closely intertwined. While Trump's harsh tariffs have opened the door for Canada to stand on its own 2 feet, Washington has, perhaps unwittingly, caused an ally to distribute eggs in one basket. Time will tell whether this picture will be permanent or temporary, but it is clear that Canada-US energy dependence is no longer as immutable a reality as it once was.